I get it that they're suffering. I get it that they have a lack of entitlement, that they can't find their place in life. Maybe there's a social and economic explanation for what's happened to them. Like, how did they get so alienated? Why don't they have jobs that are fulfilling? Why aren't they more fully part of communities that would help them see other values? I think we need an historical analysis of that. And that means like suspending judgment. We're not just saying, oh my God, they're terrible people. We're asking, wow, how did that terribleness come about? To the degree that the radical right is either evangelical or participates in a form of Christian nationalism, as it does not only in the US, but in places like Hungary. Gender is understood to be something that calls into question the primacy of the heterosexual family and distinct differences between men and women, the God-given nature of sex, and all the social orders that are based on that, including civilization itself.
Judith Butler, welcome back to PoliticsJOE.
Thank you, glad to be here.
It's an absolute pleasure. For those who aren't familiar with you, maybe didn't catch your last interview, how would you like to introduce yourself?
I'm Judith Butler. I am a distinguished professor in the graduate school at the University of California at Berkeley, and the author of several books, most recently Who's Afraid of Gender, published by Penguin, now in paperback, affordable for students.
I think like last time, it's probably useful to just start with a brief definition of terms. So could you explain what the word gender means to you? And perhaps it would be useful to sort of signpost where perhaps your use of it is a little different to the way that other people might use it.
You know, it's a really good question. And in my early years, maybe 35 years ago or so, I did have a theory of gender, and I put that out and defended it. But now I'm doing something else, which is not offering a definition of gender, but tracking the way gender has become a highly inflammatory issue in public life. So some people mean by gender identity, like how do you identify? Are you a man or woman? Do you have another category? In the history of feminism, gender was a category of analysis, a way of tracking forms of power, thinking about systemic inequalities or exclusions, or it was a framework for understanding how power is distributed according to notions of masculinity and femininity. But, I know that it's going to sound perhaps odd, but I don't have a single definition of gender. I think I'm interested in how people do approach it and what they make of it. It now has so many meanings that it's hard to track. So rather than a person with a theory of gender that I'm defending, I'm more a critic who's tracking what's become of this term. And I mean, it is significant in the sense that I do hold that people have a false idea of what gender is or can be, but I don't then return them to a single definition. I suggest that they consider the variety of approaches that we find in, say, gender studies programs. And I can't settle those debates, right?
Why not? Come on.
I'm not, but it's important to see that, there are the materialists, there's the intersectional people, there's the post-structuralists, there's the historians, and among them, deep differences between cultural historians and economic historians. I mean, we have many different approaches to the question of gender, and we should keep those approaches open, and we should value the complexity of those debates. But we're living in a time when that's being shut down, or when a single caricature of gender has replaced a really complex field of study that's represented at every major research university in the world. So that doesn't answer you, and I'm really sorry.
No, that's a great answer, actually, to be honest with you. Okay, so without talking specifically about gender, you got me thinking there about whether or not that's part of a broader, perhaps academic, discursive trend to seek to reduce and simplify, could be gender, could be economics, could be politics, take your pick, whether you think that what's happening in the field of gender studies in terms of it becoming more intense, national politics, people invoking gender in quite an explicit political way, is that unique to gender studies? Do you think there's a broader trend going on about sort of the rejection of complexity, the rejection of nuance, the rejection of intellectual debate?
I think the opposite. I think that the academic study of gender in relation to race, histories of colonialism, capitalism, ecological catastrophe, like all of that has become much more complex in recent years. So most people who are in departments of gender, women's studies, sexuality studies are also very involved in other kinds of issues, looking at the history of race, the intersection of race and gender. How do we think about the two together? How do we think the global South, the global North? How does that affect our framework? So it's only gotten more complex in the academic sphere. I think in the public sphere, there's an anti-intellectual impetus and even an anti-academic animus, which is which says, oh, all these people are doing the same thing. And they have a single doctrine, and they make you line up and pledge allegiance to their doctrine, and you can't take one of those classes unless you come out believing the same thing as everybody else. And that, to me, is, well, we could make a comedy out of it, except it's really deathly serious, because there are attacks on gender studies programs, and there's attacks now on gender as the very concept of gender. Like, we can't think about the different configurations of masculine, feminine, and other kinds of categories throughout history or across cultures. We can't look at them from the history of science. We can't look at them from the history of economics. No, we're not allowed to even talk about the thing. We have to go back to either a biological reductionism that says there's only male and female, and that biological difference is a fact. And end of discussion, right? And an immutable fact, kind of taking religious language from the Vatican, which is what Trump has done. And so, you just get this hard line, which is a doctrine, by the way, and a suppression of inquiry, and a suppression of open debate, and an attack on universities and critical thought more broadly. Critical thought in the true sense of critical thought, that is to say, belonging to the history of critical philosophy, which looks at the conditions of our lives and seeks to uncover what we're presupposing about those conditions and how we might think critically about what we have assumed to be true for so long. Not the sense in which, say, the gender critical movement uses it. For them, critical is just negative, like against. But that's, I think, a misunderstanding of the history of critique and critical philosophy. But you see, now I'm getting nerdy. Let's go on to let's go on to something else.
We are here for nerdy.
Okay.
We are here for complex, by all means.
Well, I'm trying to make nerdy available. That seems to be my new job.
Look, you mentioned Trump. He's been elected since we last spoke.
Yeah.
Perhaps you could talk a little bit about how that election connects to Who's Afraid of Gender, and how, whether or not you think that evolves the central theme of the book. How does it touch it? How does it change it?
Yeah. Well, in the book, published last year about this time, I remarked that the anti-gender ideology movement had come late to the United States, that it was active in Latin America, in Eastern Europe, in Russia, in parts of Africa, way before it became something that anybody even knew about in the U.S. And it's clearly entered the U.S. through an elaborate network of churches and family councils that are very conservative in nature. And they were able to connect with Pence and Orban met, and then Trump and the Republican Party more broadly, and what's called the CPAC, the basic conservative political action committee that debates what the platform should be. So we can link all those things, and we see that towards the end of the campaign, Trump drew attention to the fact that Kamala Harris was in favor of trans rights more broadly. And then there were some vicious caricatures that were communicated about her position. For instance, a robocall that went through the state of Michigan claiming that Kamala Harris, if elected, would authorize trans surgeries on undocumented migrants, right? So, of course, this is not true, but that's never stopped Trump and his people from saying things. But what it did is it aroused people's fears about trans surgery on young people, trans surgery in general, and migrants who are said to be replacing them in their jobs or contesting white supremacy in the United States or any number of things. Eating dogs, yes, all kinds of pretty vicious caricature. So he put those two things together, appealing to people's fears, but also their deep prejudices, and basically said Harris was the candidate of they, them. So what does that mean? Not only is she a coastal elite, well-educated, who at least takes seriously the issue of pronouns, but she's a woman of color who's a coastal elite, who does not represent so-called middle America. And so he was able, through different kinds of ploys, and this is just one of them, or the robocall is just one of them, to arouse fear, and also the desire for a return to a former time, or a time of where men were men and women were women, and so-and-so's a real man and this one's a real woman, and where we somehow live in a hierarchical and stable gender order. So he did kind of promise a return to that kind of stability, although stability is not something that is of value, I think, for him. He knew how to use it as a rhetorical appeal. So it has become now quite serious with the executive order banning gender ideology extremism and claiming to do so in order to save women. And that means now that we're seeing all kinds of public policy, including public education, take gender out of its policies, out of its libraries. We're seeing granting organizations say they will not consider proposals that have gender in them. We're seeing healthcare organized in ways such that trans people are not recognized as trans, and so as having specific kinds of health needs. People are being forcibly returned to the sex assigned at birth, and more recently we had trans women transferred into men's prisons because they're really men, and they immediately started getting harassed and violated, and they had to be moved again. So, it's also just really significant that the executive branch thinks it has the power and is seeking to exercise the power to deny the legal rights of trans people, the legal existence of trans people. Now, they still exist. They're just not recognized by their state. So the whole thing has, how do we put it, provincialized the United States. In other words, we're a whole lot like Poland was before the last election. We're a whole lot like Orban's Hungary. We're a whole lot like Bolsonaro's Brazil. In other words, we have to look to people elsewhere to find out how they lived and organized under these kinds of conditions in which they're at risk for having their rights stripped away, detention, deportation, and the rest. It's also, I mean, we can talk about this, it's also important to link these struggles because the anti-gender ideology movement now, as it's working, is a rights stripping activity, and that's also what's happening to migrants. It's also what's happening to international students who stand up for Palestine. And now citizens who are being detained and interrogated and whose rights are much more fragile, especially if they are considered to be internal enemies of the state.
There's a lot of substance in your answer there that I want to drill into. But I'll ask you to forgive me for focusing on the personal, because I can't help but think that when you reference those executive orders talking about gender ideology extremism, they're obviously not just talking about you singularly, certainly the field of work that you're involved in, and to be described as an extremist, regardless of whether, whatever you work in, is clearly quite a confronting and possibly alarming thing in the context of what you just described about the way that the US federal government is treating people that it views as extremists. You don't think you're an extremist, presumably? How does it feel to have someone speak about you like that?
Oh, well, I actually don't take it personally at all. I think in that order, the extremism of gender ideology has to do with its apparent or alleged refusal to acknowledge the biological and immutable differences between the sexes. And in fact, I mean, there are a lot of people in gender studies who work on biology, especially in developmental biology, and are very interested in questions of sex determination, and nobody denies biology, but biology turns out to be a lot more complex than just two facts that are immutable. And in fact, the language of immutability obviously comes from the Vatican doctrine, from the Family Council, and from various pronouncements that the last two popes have made about the immutability of sexual difference and why that's important for their theological ideas about complementarity and what the human is. Right? You can't have a human without two sexes, and if you have more than two sexes, you lose the idea of the human. So, in fact, if you look closely at that doctrine, it's caricaturing gender studies scholars who talk about the constructed status of sex, and that doesn't mean it's fictive or false. It just means there are a lot of different factors that go into making the sex that we are, and anybody in developmental biology will actually agree with that, right? Because genes don't even get activated unless there's an interaction with hormones or with what they call epigenetic factors, environmental factors. It's made. it's built up, and it does change, and people do change their legal status as well. And so, but no, I don't take it personally. I think it's important to read that, like, oh, what are they calling extremist? But most of these allegations that are made by the Trump administration are also confessions of what they themselves are doing in the very act, right? So it's an extremist act to ban, not just a version of gender studies, like gender ideology extremism, all gender, the word itself. I mean, in fact, what has happened is that people are starting to take it out of their institutional policies with enormous consequences for women, for feminism, for gay and lesbian and trans people, bisexual, non-binary, intersex, but also for people who are doing health and family stuff and trying to work on sex discrimination and gender-based violence. If you take gender out of gender-based violence, as Erdogan finally decided he wanted to do, which is why he withdrew from the Istanbul Convention, you're not able to name the systemic ways that men actually violate women or give themselves and each other permission to enact violence You're not able to do an analysis. A gendered analysis asks, why is it that men do this repeatedly? What is the systemic structure of this? How do we understand that socially, historically, within the context of the family, within the context of schooling or of gender formation? But we need that framework. Otherwise, how do we even ask that question? So women are not saved by getting rid of gender. First of all, they are a gender, and they're the ones who came up as feminists with gendered frameworks for social analyses of violence. And this is a ruse to augment state power and to justify radical censorship and silencing.
I was glad you mentioned censorship there, because it feels deeply just hypocritical, I guess, to speaking as a European, to have J.D. Vance coming in sort of lecturing us about free speech.
Unbelievable.
You know, you're abandoning Enlightenment values. The UK draws particular ire for some reason as well, and it seems to me that there are kind of, whether it's like you said, pro-Palestine activists, some people with green cards being subject to the full frontal violence of the federal government. To the extent that you just mentioned within sort of various programs, be they educational or otherwise. And
grant research, scientific research, grants in the humanities and the arts. Every single field is suffering from this kind of censorship.
And it makes me wonder, is free speech essentially a sort of a Trojan horse for the political project, right, of the MAGA movement, where essentially they dress up concerns around European politics and label it as a free speech issue, when in actually it's probably got more to do with a deep ideological aversion to social democracy and various, defining characteristics of European politics. Because for all the things that we've just detailed, they're going to go, I don't think you talk the talk, but you don't walk the walk when it comes to protecting free speech, when it comes to rejecting censorship.
That's for sure. I think that that free speech for someone like Vance, if he actually means something by it, other than using it as a club, I think free speech has to do with individualism. It's a hyper-libertarian idea that goes along with free market ideology, but also goes along with American versions of capitalism and of power. Religious institutions have gained rights of free speech by claiming, that they don't want to associate with people who are gay or lesbian or trans. So free speech becomes a way of authorizing discrimination. Free speech becomes a way of authorizing bullying or even hate speech. And I think we have to take it back. I don't want the right wing to have free speech in this way. I think, Vance is actually breaking a set of contracts and understandings with Europe and also bullying Europe at the same time. So his free speech is a freedom to break a contract, to break a covenant, to betray an understanding, to lie about your friends, and to bully people into lining up behind him. So it's a pretty bad exercise of free speech if you think about it. We don't want that model. I think there is a model of free speech, freedom of speech, that is collective and that is exemplified precisely by public protests on principled grounds. But public protests on principled grounds are no longer as protected as they were, and academic freedom is no longer protected as it was under the current administration, and we're seeing both the erosion of constitutional democratic principles, but also the appropriation of those principles, the name of those principles, like free speech, in the service of their destruction.
In our last conversation, I asked you about the sort of political function of the refrain you often hear. We were hearing a lot at the time about what is a woman. It was invoked a lot of the time by the Prime Minister then in Parliament to sort of attack our now Prime Minister Keir Starmer, and how women perform gender. And your answer went viral quite recently.
Yeah.
In the UK, there's this Netflix show that's come out recently called Adolescence, and it's provoked a lot of discussion and debate around masculinity. And, you know, I'm not asking you to sort of culturally critique the show, but I wondered if you could touch on how kind of within a patriarchy men perform masculinity, and if in your view that performance can be harmful to them.
Harmful to them,
Yeah.
yes. Well, it's interesting. I was speaking the other day with Sean Fay, who said that she came to understand that those who expressed hatred toward her were disfiguring themselves. They were damaging themselves with that form of hatred. So to do violence to another is also to violate something about your own humanity, or to lose sight of it, or to destroy it even. And I do think that boys very often suffer from masculine norms that they're compelled to enact, especially if those norms are brutal or derisive or violent. They become something that is internally damaged. They become people who are internally damaged, and who hopefully one day can take responsibility for their actions and become a different kind of person. I mean, the problem with the approach is, of course, if the violence is against women, it's women and girls who are being hurt and damaged. So we need to pay attention there first. But if we take the point of view of reparative justice, right, then both parties would have to change or come forward with the story of their women, with the story of their damage, if it is women who are hurt, and men with a way of taking responsibility for what they've done, and trying to make amends. Sometimes it's boys who don't fit the norms, though, who are hassled in schools. They're seen as effeminate. They're not occupying masculine norms in the right way. And sometimes it's girls who are particularly strong who become a threat. It's hard for me to know. I haven't seen the television show, so I can't comment on that. But I am aware that there are a lot of lonely, enraged young men in the United States who voted for Trump. And I wondered whether that was a kind of incel community that was pro-Trump, full of rage and entitlement, and not understanding why they're not getting the sex they want or the connection they want, and who feel that the world is against them and it's the fault of feminism, or that women have become something other than what they wanted or knew. A lot of resentment, a lot of anger, a lot of isolation, a lot of connectedness to the internet and to other people whose anger and rage escalates one's own. So that is a masculine culture that I think we need to pay more attention to, and it's also a voting bloc. And they're going right. Yeah. They're going right. And they would love the caricatures of Kamala Harris that Trump offered.
In a second, let's talk about that sort of right-wing politics and how it connects there. But you're making me, we were talking there about rage and entitlement and these traits that when described in a person, you think, well, that person sounds distinctly unpleasant. That sounds like the sort of person I want to be around. That sounds like the sort of person I want to engage with.
Yeah.
And it makes me think about bell hooks. You know, to create loving men, we have to love males. Okay, let's apply that logic then to these enraged, possibly dangerous, unpleasant people, it feels so counterintuitive to be like, you need to love that person. Do you know what I mean?
Sure.
You need like, and how do you see? I appreciate like de-radicalization is an entire field of study, but how do you see accessing those people, helping those people? Can they be saved? And maybe I'm invoking the language of sort of evangelicals, which I don't mean to.
Yeah, I don't have an idea about how to approach those kinds of young men, and maybe they're older men as well. But I mean, I get it that they're suffering. I get it that they have a lack of entitlement, that they can't find their place in life. But maybe there's a social and economic explanation for what's happened to them. Like, how did they get so alienated? Why don't they have jobs that are fulfilling? Why aren't they more fully part of communities that would help them see other values? I think we need an historical analysis of that. And that means like suspending judgment. We're not just saying, oh my God, they're terrible people. We're asking, wow, how did that terribleness come about? And we're then at least providing a framework within which we could ask, how do we get them out of this? Or how can we make an appeal to them that would be different? I do think the answer to that, I'm going to shift this just a tiny bit, with the answer to the Christian right escalation of hatred. Hatred against trans people, hatred against the LGBTQIA plus movement, hatred against migrants, Christian nationalism as it links with white supremacy. I mean, there are other forms of Christians, and there are other forms of religion. And, you know, Christianity always had a doctrine of love, a kind of caritas, you know, like the love of humanity.
Agape, yeah.
Well, agape as well. And then it's like giving to others and being connected with others. But, you know, I remember going to a Catholic church as a young person. I grew up Jewish, but I was part of the anti-war mobilization as a young person. It was the Vietnam War. And I would go to this Catholic church every weekend to just listen to their anti-war rhetoric. It was beautiful. They had incredible lectures, they had singing, they had food, they talked about what it meant to be anti-war, and they mobilized. And I loved that community. But it stood for another set of values, as does the left-wing Episcopalian community in the US, which is providing the sanctuary network for migrants. So, you know, Christianity can go a lot of different ways, and so can religion. And I sometimes wonder whether we need to bring people back to a different understanding of their formations. That veers away from the young men.
Please, very, very, very happy for you to talk about it.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll sort of add a suffix to what you're saying, and then maybe we'll talk about sort of the connection between the radical right and sort of conservative ideas of gender. But as a British person, I do find sort of the strength of evangelism, like it's almost omnipresent, again, to invoke sort of theological terminology within American politics. It just seems so alien to me, so affronting, and maybe that's just sort of like latent Britishness in me. But I do know that certainly the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship, ARC, are trying to create a more Atlanticist, connected, evangelical conservative movement. And
Wow.
there is this it's growing now here in the UK, which I didn't think I probably would ever see. Let's move on. Why do you think, or let's just talk about how sort of populism / the radical right does go hand in hand with a kind of conservative understanding of gender, if you could sort of kick us off from there.
Oh, well, I think that to the degree that the radical right is either evangelical or participates in a form of Christian nationalism, as it does not only in the US but in places like Hungary, we see that Gender is understood to be something that calls into question the primacy of the heterosexual family, the hierarchical and distinct differences between men and women, the God-given nature of sex, and all the social orders that are based on that, including civilization itself. So in some of the churches, gender ideology is actually described as demonic or diabolical, that it will destroy your way of life. And of course, my question is, well, maybe something is destroying your way of life. You know, maybe your work is not as secure as it used to be. Maybe you don't even have a union anymore. Maybe you lost your job, or climate catastrophe has forced you to move and lose your initial place of dwelling and belonging. Maybe the world feels out of control for you. The oligarchical billionaires are getting richer, and more people are losing the capacity to own a home or make ends meet. There are all kinds of reasons to fear for the future, or to fear that your intimate world will be destroyed. I'm not sure gender is actually one of them. In fact, I'm pretty sure it's not.
Yeah, I think it's the refrain I heard is, your landlord probably isn't a trans person. Do you know what I mean? The people that are enacting rentier capitalism,
yes,
are generally not the marginalized groups
yes,
we're talking about.
Right. But what we're seeing is not only targeting of the most vulnerable people in society, but we're holding them accountable for massive acts of destruction that have been undertaken by corporate power and have been authorized by deregulated capitalism in our time. So, it's our job to kind of come back and say, you know what? You know why you're afraid? You know why we're all afraid? You know why we're living with this anxiety that makes us so vulnerable to the demagogues? Here are some reasons, and this is the mobilization you need to be part of. But we do need to come back, and we have to find people where they're living in fear, in anxiety, in with a sense of loss, or a sense of real dread. I don't think the Democratic Party in the U.S. has the slightest idea of how to reach people at that level.
Yeah, I agree with you. There's probably a whole other hour's worth of conversation.
Yes. I think
in that one.
No, I think its responsibility is actually to shut itself down and let a new structure emerge.
Do you think?
Yes.
Yeah.
But it will never see that.
Yeah. Okay. So look, the arguments you're making, they're similar to ones that I would make, right? Which is, yeah, okay, you can blame a trans person, you can blame a migrant, you can take your pick, marginalized community, right? Or you can engage with a structural critique of capitalism, the economic and political system that has created the material conditions in which you live. And increasingly, when you look across the economically developed world, I would point to South Korea as probably the most striking example of this. There is now an increasing gender divide.
Yes.
In political interpretations and critiques. So in Korea, it's most explicit, where women are veering liberal, men are veering conservative. In the UK, it's far less pronounced, but there is still a gap between the two, particularly in the younger generation. Young men are less liberal than young women. When you look at those disparities, or that divergence, how do you understand it? Do you believe it connects to gender and gender politics? Is it socioeconomic in the way that I've sort of framed it there? What's your understanding?
Well, it's always a good question, and I never have a good answer.
But it's not a good question then.
But I do think that women generally understand something about networks of care and the values of social services that help to provide healthcare, education, transportation, libraries, all the things that are linked with having a a decent life, especially if you've got dependents who need all those things. So, I mean, what's happening now under neoliberalism is, as you know, that social services are being decimated, or they're no longer working, and that then puts a lot of pressure on the family to absorb all the tasks that social services have provided, and that means women have to stay home, and more labor hours are expended in care work than ever before. So there are some women who will embrace that as their proper natural function on the right wing, but there are a whole lot of other women who are saying, you know what, this is not okay. I need infrastructural support for family, community, and more broadly, you know, for everyone in this country, and they will move in more social democratic directions, if not socialist ones. So I do think we have to see it in that context. I don't think it's anything essential about men or women, but I do think it's about the sexual division of labor and what kind of perspective that gives you.
I'm really glad you raised that point, because I think, particularly, you know, to say within the UK context, okay, 14 years of conservative austerity, that means that now 70% of schools in Britain have less funding than they did in 2010.
Yeah, unbelievable.
And you can just point to across civil society, whether it's, you know, the collapse of third spaces, civic institutions, swimming pools,
Right.
libraries, all of the things
Yes.
you spoke about.
Yeah.
And we're quite good at, certainly from a leftist perspective, talking about the quite nuts and bolts policy aspect side of things, but the almost unspoken, unsaid is how that then connects to, like you said, family, the gender-based division of labour, and who is carrying that
Yes,
labour.
who's carrying it?
Who's it
Who's
for?
bearing it?
Yeah.
And who's being directly affected by the breakdown of infrastructure?
Absolutely. A slight backtrack to my previous questions, but I was just thinking about when we are talking about marginalised communities, marginalised groups, there is a tendency now, certainly on the American side, increasingly actually happening in the UK too, to just kind of use the abbreviation DEI
Yeah.
as almost, well, possibly as a byword, right? Rather than saying, you know, we want to take people of colour out of public life, we want to take trans people out of public life, we want to
Yeah.
remove them from these programs, because obviously you'd probably be saying the quiet part loud if you were to do that. To what extent do you understand DEI as almost a byword, a dog
Yes.
whistle? Is that
Well,
how you understand
I
it?
think both so-called gender ideology and DEI are standing for a lot of different things.
Go on.
So they become right-wing shorthand.
Yeah.
Right? We have to learn to read their lexicon. DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, on the one hand, you know, describes a program that sought to provide opportunities for people of color who were traditionally excluded from different educational institutions and workplaces, in order to create a more equal world. But of course, it now stands for anything that has to do with race for the right wing. So for instance, the same people who are saying, oh, in the university, they're going to tell you that the United States is systemically racist, or it's been racist since the beginning, it's always racist, it's pervasively racist. They're attacking that. They don't want that taught. So how do you do that? Well, you do it by making sure there are fewer people of color in the university, but also targeting race-based disciplines, programs, forms of research that are based on race. You claim that they're not neutral. You claim that they discriminate against white people. And now Trump is actually listening to the South African white supremacist movement that tells him that white people have been discriminated against in South Africa. And, you know, in the Department of Justice, I believe they're starting to take down pictures of any black people who were ever, you know, part of the history of that institution. So this is a racist project. It's not an opposition to a particular policy. It's a racist project. We're going to take race out of the schools. We're going to take race out of our public appearance. We're going to substitute white men when we can for everybody else. And we're going to stop the discrimination against white people, and their rightful place in the world. So I think of it as a white supremacist project, to tell you the truth.
Interesting. Maybe this is a redundant question because they've just won an election. But is it politically expedient? Because I'm constantly torn between saying, no, it's about the material conditions, it's about the price of groceries, it's about the price of gas, and it's about inflation. And look across incumbent governments and post-COVID inflationary pressure, incumbents have fallen, right? But particularly in the American instance, culture and culture war, I feel, is so intrinsically connected to the MAGA project that the reason I asked the question is because do you think that it generates political capital? Does it just serve to animate a base? Does someone genuinely say, when the price of eggs is what it is in America, no, do you know what, actually it's DEI programs. That's what I'm going to go to the polls over. You see what I'm asking? Maybe a better way of saying it is, like, what is its political purpose?
Well, I think that, look, workers have a lot of resentment. Workers are really angry. They worked their whole lives. They thought they were going to have a good pension. They thought they were going to have job security. They thought they were going to be able to leave wealth to their children. And they're not able to do that. And they don't understand why. And they have to find reasons for that. So, you can say, well, look how capitalism is operating, and look at what's going on in your communities, who's profiting and who's not. Or you can say migrants and black people and brown people and coastal elites and gender ideologists are ruining our world, and that everything will go back to the way it is. I think you have to, even a good materialist, economic analysis of worker discontent has to understand what the power is of that appeal to go back to the way things were, to restore stability, to restore hierarchy. You will be the man you've always been. You will be, you will get back what you earned. You will be wealthier with Trump. He will take down your taxes. He will help you to invest. You won't be burdened by bureaucracies and regulations, and you won't be sitting back watching black and brown people take jobs that you think you should have, right? So the resentment thing is huge, as is what I would call a furious nostalgia, just furious nostalgia. Like, I really want that back. I really want my place back. I really want the promise that I was working with back. And I mean, we would be foolish not to see that that's part of what's going on.
Do you know, I was going to ask you about nostalgia and nostalgia as an impulse and as a political tool, but I think you're right. It has that emotion attached to it, right? It is. It's
not just like sad and wistful. Oh, I wish things were different. No. It's we're gonna restore our rightful place. It's a restoration fantasy. We're gonna restore the order. We're gonna have white men on top again. We're going to be free to hate, and nobody's going to tell us that we're not allowed to say what we want to say about black and brown people and women and gay and lesbian people. And those censors are going to be gone. We're going to be free. We're going to be exercising free speech along with Mr. Vance, truly free speech, which is not, encumbered or constrained by those leftist censors.
Yeah.
And now they've got state censorship. Now they're implementing state censorship as a way of freeing those from the censorship of the ostensible censorship of the left.
Free speech, as long as it agrees with my political ideology.
Yeah.
Judith Butler, thank you so much for coming to speak to us again. I really appreciate it. Who's Afraid of Gender? The paperback. I'll hold it up for a second time. Do my best QVC impression. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Okay.
Thank you for coming in.
Thank you.